Going to start on to the policy discussions. We're just a little behind, but doing very well. The policy discussions will resume with draft policy 2014-14, removing needs tests from small IPv4 transfers. And we're going to have John Springer come up and do the presentation. I need my head table. I see them coming. Mr. Sweeting, Vice Chair AC Dan, our Chair, and our Vice Chair, Paul Anderson. Paul, if you're out there, come join us. Okay, John Springer, go right ahead.
Thank you, John. So, good afternoon, everybody. This policy proposal 2014-14 came out of a policy experience report that was given in Chicago this spring. ARIN staff stated that there were some issues with the ability to roll out transfers in a timely manner. There has been some community comment on this as well. And a bright-eyed member of the community hopped on that and said, well, if we did less needs assessment on transfers, that might help. So the problem statement is that ARIN staff, faced with a surge in near exhaustion allocation and subsequent transfer requests and a requirement for team review, spending a lot of time on small transfers. Get rid of the needs test, that'll take some of the burden off. We've got two changes proposed that are nearly identical, a change to NRPM 8.3 and one for 8.4. We've tried to make the wording as nearly identical as possible to eliminate as much confusion as we can. So this text is in your books, and I'm not going to read it. Essentially, what it means, what it states, is that for incoming address transfers, 16 and smaller, the author proposes that we not conduct a needs test based on the idea that they may only do this once per year, and based on that taking place. After that, they justify based on a 24-month supply. Been a lot of talk in the community about this over the years. It's difficult to summarize all of the various positions and arguments for and against. There has been quite a bit of concern about the idea of hoarding and speculation based on the trafficking in IPv4 numbers. There are people making a living doing this that have become regular citizens of the ARIN community. Some of these folks over the years have made some pretty dramatic efforts to reduce or remove needs testing. Most of those have been rebuffed. So what we see here is an attempt to work for incremental change, to seek a middle ground somewhere between the elimination of needs test and the continuance of needs test for every transfer. Normally, we do not do staff and legal review for draft policies. We typically will wait until we advance something to the recommended draft policy state before doing this. However, we have a couple of draft policies here today. This one, 2014-14, and coming right up next, 2014-20, that are looking at this subject from different telescopes. So both Kevin and I thought it was prudent to obtain some additional information for the community's review so that we could evaluate some other things. This also is included in your program. The reason I put it in is that according to ARIN staff, an exception at the 16 boundary and below would affect a reduction in the number of transfers of 85% approximately. So just, there's two numbers that, and I'll be talking about this in a minute, but two numbers associated with this phenomenon. So of all of the transfer requests that come in, the number of them, 85%, are smaller than a 16. As we'll see in a minute, that turns out to be a very much of a disparity when you look at the actual numbers that are transferred. My good friend Owen DeLong did some very kind analysis of this subject. What we have here are the various CIDR notations. The center column represents the number of addresses contained in that category and the ones above. And the one on the right, no, I'm reversing. Yeah, that's right. The one on the right is the number of the actual transactions.
That's transfers to date.
To date, yeah, of which there are 216. It should be pointed out that past behavior is no guarantee of future performance. If we were to run the free pool dry, as we are certain to do, then these numbers could be expected to change. So what do we make of this? Well, 89% of the actual number of transfers are 16 and smaller. That represents only 17% of the address space transferred. That means that 83% of the numbers, the total amount of numbers transferred, would not be affected by this policy. Now, one of the most prominent objections to this policy up until now is that 16 is too big. Too big for what? The assumption is that too big in some way refers to a hazard to the internet routing table. We'll examine that somewhat here coming up. So maybe 16 is the wrong number. Maybe 17% of the actual numbers of addresses affected by this policy is too much of a hazard. Well, 17 doesn't look all that good. Nobody likes odd-numbered boundaries. And Owen has proposed 20, which is a very, very safe level of potential hazard. But somewhere between 16 and 20, perhaps we can have a discussion about what level of risk the community has a stomach for. Maybe it's 18. So where we are in the process. So to get here to being a draft policy, the advisory council had to ask itself two things. Is the problem statement clear, and is it in scope? Now, there are a number of criticisms that could be made of this problem statement, but unclear it is not. And the first thing that occurred to me was, since we're talking about directly influencing the activity of ARIN staff, whether that was out of scope for the advisory council, and that question was asked and answered, and it is. So the next level that we would take this to would be to take it to recommended draft policy. And we have 3 hurdles here. The draft policy needs to enable fair and impartial number resource administration, be technically sound, and be supported by the community. I could go on at some length about all of these, and we'll be discussing some of the parameters of that when we talk about people's comments. But the argument can be made, and I might make in our meeting later this week, that these criteria have been met. Now, this slide was made up earlier in this week where I was very much focused on fostering input from the community, which I still am. At this point, I've received enough feedback from the community that I don't think, unless I get an overwhelming groundswell, that I'm going to be recommending to move this to draft policy. We've had a number of suggestions that make sense, not only adjusting the boundary location, but also things like suggesting an attestation of a company officer for a substitute for need. In any case, I still want to hear any reasons that you might have not to do this. Starting now.
Microphones are open.
Hello, thank you very much. It's Donnie Roisman from SoftLayer. A few comments here. One thing is that if this does move to draft policy, I think there's a technical change that has to be made. Can you go back to the actual changed language slide, please? There we go. Okay, so the very last part of that says, okay, so the new draft language ends with the recipient must demonstrate the need. Oh, so there we go. For transfers larger than /16, et cetera, they must demonstrate need and sign an RSA. The problem is that if you just do that rename, it also means that transfers 16 and smaller no longer need to sign an RSA. So just one technical note, I'd recommend we move the must sign an RSA to its own separate bullet, because I believe we all agree that an RSA needs to be signed, regardless of the size of transfer.
Noted.
It says, the new language will both say sign an RSA, but that will only apply to /16 or larger than /16. /16 and smaller will no longer have any language and you must sign an RSA. So I'm just saying sign RSA should just be its own separate bullet. Right.
Noted.
Okay. The other thing is regarding attestation, I definitely do agree an attestation has to happen. I believe that is already covered because in 8.3 it does state, excuse me one second here, there's a blanket statement, I just want to quote it precisely. I'm having to, the policies transferred will be subject to current ARIN policies. Sorry, the resources transferred will be subject to current ARIN policies. And I believe an attestation can arguably be considered within current ARIN policies. Anytime you get additional IP address space and you do a needs-based assessment, an attestation, Section 4 is part of that.
I'll bring that up on the AC when we discuss
Okay.
this.
I also generally propose. I generally support this proposal. I believe we definitely should be moving towards reducing the needs-based work in 8.2 and 8.3. The problem statement, while I appreciate this problem statement, and I definitely feel for ARIN staff that have been clearly burdened by all of these transfers, I think there are additional reasons as well, which has to do with just the complexity of growing companies and needs-based for transfers. I think in general I would support removing all needs-based, although I definitely appreciate that a /16 is up to a /16 is a very good first step. So in general I would oppose this moving forward with the minor modifications that I recommended earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a practical matter, making a problem statement with a lot of different problems being solved leads to difficulties.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yes.
Just one comment regarding the problem statement. I note that the condition of having team review for IPv4 assignments and allocations is a transient condition that will, with free pool run out, likely drop. We may not see quite the same level of activity, and we will not have a free pool. We're worried about serialization. We will be worried about adding people to the waiting list in appropriate order. But it is true that the current problem statement is a problem statement addressing a transient condition. So the only thing the AC may want to consider is, if it's not going to be adopted promptly, you may have to touch the problem statement to make it timely to the future conditions, because this won't last as a current issue forever.
We have a remote comment.
Marla Azinger, Frontier Communications, no support. Fair and impartial has not been met. Everyone should be showing there is a need. Something else needs to be made clear that has been ignored for years. The size of a company does not remove the scale of complexity, monetary constraints, or scale of possible hoarding. I don't find it any less abusive for a small entity that really only needs 30 IP addresses to hoard a whole /24 than I do a large entity that only needs 8,192 IP addresses that hoards a /16. I hear this community repeatedly say they want to see ARIN function on a level of equality. So let's do that and stop trying to say one size of a company should be treated better than another. This policy would blatantly give smaller companies a golden pass and continue to require extensive details for larger companies. And as a person who actually spends their days reviewing IP requests, I can validate for you that there are a lot of ISPs that claim they need a /24 or more when in fact they don't. I don't support no need, but if ARIN is going to do this, then ARIN needs to open the barn door equally for all members.
Thank you. Owen?
Owen DeLong, Black Lotus Communications, ARIN AC. I'm opposed to the policy as written. I would be opposed to it at the /20 level, but not so vehemently. I think removing needs test is a bad idea. I think if we are going to do it, we should treat it as a very, very cautious experiment and do it very slowly, walking bits left as we see things working out or not. And so, you know, I think the analysis shows that if this really is a workload concern as expressed in the problem statement, we can address 62% of the workload while only risking roughly 1% of the total address space that's been transferred so far. Yeah, that's not a tremendously accurate predictor of future performance, but it's the best we've got to work with for the time being. So I think that that's a reasonable trade-off of bang for the buck, you know, or even 21 or 22.
Thanks, Owen. Rob?
Rob Seastrom, Time Warner Cable, ARIN AC. Is this mic actually on?
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to echo Owen's comments with some observations. I originally thought that this was a horrible idea, and my thinking on this has evolved after listening to the community talk and after reading staff and legal assessment. Many years ago, we had people talking about a transfer market, and there was a lot of discussion about, well, you know, why do we need this before there's actually this is the only way to do it. So, you know, why do we want to implement it now instead of later? And the answer, of course, was to get experience with it and be able to modify our rules and operations as relates to that experience. So it is with this, that I think that trying to go for a one and done sort of proposal and get the prefix length correct on the first try and make it huge is probably a bad idea. That said, if we think that we want to if we want to get rid of needs-based to some degree, we should do it on small prefixes so that the amount of risk that we are taking is commensurately less. And as soon as that policy is implemented, there should immediately be a new policy to modify the length, to shorten the length of the prefix. And we should have that dialogue based on what we see with the experience with the longer prefixes. And we might have to repeat that more than once, because I think that we can't get the genie back in the bottle if we stick it at 16. But if we go to, say, 22 or 24, 24 is probably too small, maybe a 22. The smaller it is, generally, the more I support it. But I think that a 16 is too big. So conceptually, I've come around to supporting this, but at a /16, I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin?
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire, ARIN-AC. I have a question, Part A for staff. Extra, extra small, small. What is the total number of companies that, percentage-wise, is it 85, 90% of all companies in the ARIN region fit into that category, give or take?
You're talking about counting both V4 and V6 resources.
V4 in this case would be the most appropriate, but just a ballpark. Are we talking, it's a significant portion of the ARIN community?
Give me 30 seconds, hold on.
So while John's looking at that, I'm bringing this up because I hate statistics. And what I hate more than anything is statistics based on an unbelievably small artificial pool that exists. So, Owen, I appreciate what you did in terms of the numbers, but it is an unbelievably small sampling of a scenario where we are not in run-out.
It's a 100% sample.
Yes. No, it is a small sample of the total number of resources out there. It is a very small sample in a very small time window. I believe that if we are trying to make this easier for the small entities, and in ARIN's, at least billing view, a small entity is a /18. Yes, John?
Just for the numbers, I'm using the statistics from 2013 full year. Extra small 455, extra small 1120, small 1923. Recognize the total pool you're talking about is 4,600. So respectively of the 4,600, again, extra small 455, 1,100 extra small, and small is nearly 2,000.
Thank you. So
75%-ish.
right. So in aggregate, so these are aggregate numbers for all of these ISPs and end users. 75% of all of the ARIN community today would be double, treble, quadruple to a factor of 60 times what they currently have utilized over the entire existence of the ARIN registry.
But then they'd all be medium.
What?
But then they'd all jump up a category.
Correct. But I'm saying in terms of this policy, just something to think about, that from a if you're going to use statistics, look at the history, the real history of what people are holding today. That was the first part to it. The second part to it was, I've heard a lot from the community in terms of this is being preferential to the small, and I'm a small ISP, would love to see something like this personally, but this is being preferential. So my question is, should we be really thinking how we can do this, not only for the small guys, but for the big guys? It might be different numbers, it might be a different ratio, it might be a different something. But I do not believe that having this only for the small players is appropriate. We need to lighten the load for everybody categorically in this area. Thank you.
Well taken. Jason?
Jason Schiller, Google, ASOAC. I wanted to echo what Kevin and what Marla said about opening the barn doors equally for everyone. When I first looked at this policy and I looked at a /16, I said, you know, what is the time horizon for a small ISP who's, say, maybe getting a /24 every quarter, a /23 a year, a /22 every 2 years? a 16 is like a 64-year supply of addresses. I'm not opposed to making the paperwork simpler for the small guys because that's difficult. I'm not opposed to lowering their overhead or getting an IP advocate that can help them and guide them through the process. But it is concerning to me that the time horizon of the amount of address that you could get is significantly different. If we look at a /21, for example, that small ISP would be getting a 2-year supply of addresses. A larger ISP that needs more than a 21 can do the paperwork and get a 2-year supply of addresses. That doesn't seem to be as inequitable as the current policy proposal. So my concern is how much space are you giving them in the time horizon, independent of my issues that I have with, not having need in general. But putting that aside, there is still an inequity with the time horizon.
Jason, you mean giving, you mean how much space you're allowing them to obtain from the market?
I'm sorry, yes, how much space they're allowed to obtain from the market. Thank you.
Just folks who want to speak on this topic, please approach the queues. I am going to close the queues shortly so that we have some chance of having 5 minutes for coffee and cookies. So line up if you wish to speak on this policy proposal.
Mike.
Mike Joseph, Google. A couple points I want to touch on. First off, I think we've covered the fact that passing policy to ease staff's burden is a foolhardy endeavor, so I'll move past that one. But I do want to point out, continuing the theme of fairness, which, as you pointed out, John, that's a criteria for advancing any policy. This community has defined what it envisions as efficient address utilization. That vision is codified in the NRPM in various parts of Section 4, which discuss how a resource, internet resource, is to be used. Whether or not I have a resource because I obtained it from ARIN or from ARIN's predecessor, I hold a resource that is a finite resource that fundamentally came from the community. And my use of that resource is currently governed by ARIN NRPM, which specifies how I should use it efficiently. If we start passing policy like this that allows entities to maximize their own individual gain over that of the overall community, we're going to encourage significantly inefficient use of address space. It won't be necessary to hit 80% targets on your use. It won't be necessary to hit 40% targets on your use. In fact, it won't be necessary to hit any targets on your use. You can simply purchase as much address space as you can afford, regardless of how efficiently you use it. And this means that the companies with the biggest pockets will be able to corner the market. Now, I don't think somebody's going to go out there and intentionally buy up all address space. They don't have to. You'll have enough actors out there that are going to try to buy up as much address space as they want for their purposes, regardless of how efficiently they're going to use it. And that flies in the face of the efficiency guidelines this community has established over the entire course of ARIN's history. And I think we need to think long and hard before we decide to abandon that in favor of a free-for-all based solely on how much one can afford to buy on the market. The argument that a 16 is too big or too small we can have, but the fact is large companies can benefit from this simply by spinning up shell companies or using existing shell companies. And small operators who may not need any address space whatsoever are now going to be able to obtain /24s simply by clicking a button and buying it now. No offense to my eBay friends. So this absolutely opens the floodgates. Other people have pointed out how it does so unfairly to different sized operators, but the fact is this is a slippery slope, and this isn't about making things easier for paperwork. There's a mechanism to make paperwork easier, and that's to communicate that desire to the ARIN staff. There's a mechanism to easing the burden on the ARIN staff, and that's to hire more of them. But changing policy because we have an acute problem that I'm not even sure exists that much in order to get transfers through, I think is foolhardy. So I oppose this policy.
Thank
Joseph,
you.
is there any change to this policy that would enable you to support it?
No, I think I think a policy would necessitate, for me to support it, it would have to have a component of needs basis, and that would mean eviscerating the current policy.
Thank you.
I will note a component of irony with the observation that big guys have the advantage to go out and get all the addresses that they need, whereas the proposal is unfair to big guys.
Could you clarify? You made a comment about irony of my comments. I'm curious to understand exactly what you meant.
Well, I was comparing your comments to Jason's comments. We have a assertion that on your part that the larger players can go and get their whatever addresses they need because of their size and their war chest, and yet Jason and Marla would assert that the major flaw in this policy is that it's unfair to big guys because it's setting them aside as a disprivileged class.
I think it creates unfortunate circumstances for both classes and how each size of operator in the community might choose to use this policy to bypass the intent of ARIN.
Thank you.
Folks, I'm closing the queues. Approach the queues if you're going to be here.
Marla Azinger just replied that not all big companies have deep pockets.
Okay. The queue, the queues are closed. If
And
you're
you
in
have
the
comments,
queues, you're the
too.
last speakers on this. Go ahead.
Marty?
Hi, I'm Martin Hannigan from Akamai Technologies. I think we're going in the right direction. I do believe you have a problem, and I have no doubt. I've been through this, through the request process multiple times this year, and it's taken much longer than it probably should have. And I understand I'm in a much different class, but still, from 0 to 3 months to 4 months is a long time to wait for anything. I guess I'm not really going to voice support one way or the other. I just want to make a few comments. The 16 boundary does seem to solve your problem, although it creates inequities between the smaller and the larger. I think that people are talking about ISPs, but I'll talk about CDNs, and without naming any. Some of my competitors will love this policy and will use them to their heart's content, while I'll have to sit on the sidelines, and my competition will be limited as a result. I think that you should remove needs tests altogether and let the market sort itself out. Otherwise, don't do this. Thank you.
Mr. Patak?
Matt Petak, Yahoo. I do not support this proposal. I think if the concern here is staff issues and the amount of work on the current staff at ARIN, as I recall from past ARIN meetings, there's a significant amount of money in the ARIN bank accounts at the moment. Help out the U.S. unemployment situation and hire more staff people. Thank you.
Thank you. Brandon?
So a few, is it me?
Yes.
Is the mic on? Can't really hear. Okay. Ish, okay. A few comments. First of all, there was some indication, I'm sorry, Brandon Ross, Network Utility Force. There was some indication that, small organizations are not at some sort of disadvantage and that it's just as easy for them to request IP space. I will tell you from personal experience, I have a number of small organizations that pay me to deal with ARIN for them. I suspect very strongly that if they didn't need to justify their address space, they could probably fill out the forms themselves. So while it's not in my best interest for this to pass my personal best interest, it certainly is in my customer's best interest to eliminate needs testing on small blocks. As far as what size, I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I do believe that at least somewhere in this range makes a lot of sense to determine if it makes sense to start raising that later after this is raised. So in other words, I believe this is a good compromise to determine if needs testing altogether is needed or not needed going forward, especially as the free pool is exhausted.
Thank you. RS did comment about the possibility of a certain experimental nature to all this. After all, at least some of us are scientists. David?
Hi, David Huberman from Microsoft. Do you know what happens when you need IP addresses to run your business because you're growing? You go to the RIR. And you know what happens when the RIR says no because they don't have any? you go to the market and you buy it. So this community is faced with a different question that's being talked about right now. We're going to go out and you're going to go buy your space, and the only question is, can you update who is? And under the current policy, a lot of the time that answer is no. And under this policy, this makes the answer yes for a lot more people. Nothing this community does allows someone to buy or not buy address space. I heard a lot of previous comments about we're opening up floodgates, we're taking risks, people are going to, this is going to make it the wild, wild west. Well, guess what? It already is. Many of the organizations in this room already go out and buy address space because they have to, because they operate in a region that's exhausted, or their needs are beyond that which ARIN can provide right now, and certainly beyond which ARIN can provide in a few months when it's exhausted. It's not a question of can you buy space. You can and you will because you're running a business, for profit or not. You have to grow your network. It's whether the ARIN community wants ARIN to be relevant or not. And by ARIN, I mean ARIN's who is. One last comment, Mr. Springer. When we do votes, I would ask you to please consider taking a poll of the room of whether or not there's support to remove needs basis in general, without talking about the barrier, without worrying about /20, /24, /16. My sense over this week talking to people is there's a larger percentage of people in favor of removing needs basis altogether than removing needs basis on a experimental level.
Thanks, David. I'm not sure I'm going to take a vote. There's quite a conversation going on here, and I think there's there's going to be a lot of vigorous discussion on PPML. Middle mic, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Yeah, Tom Fantacone, IB Trading. I wanted to address the objection that this is going to reduce efficient usage of the addresses because the recipients don't have to justify them. They don't have to come up with an 80% justification, or as it was quoted, even a 40% justification. We're talking about transfers here. And the sellers in these transactions, because they are sellers, right now, for the most part, have a 0% utilization of these blocks. So any way to get these into the hands of people who can use them, even at a lower level than ARIN would normally approve, is a positive. It's getting these addresses into the hands of network operators who need them. I'm an ARIN facilitator, i.e. broker, and people come to me. I'm on the front lines when it comes to people looking for address space who don't understand the process or are afraid of the process, want to talk to me in hushed tones about why they need the space. I can tell you the biggest reason people don't do transfers right now is the price. It's too expensive. That's determined right there. That's why people are not going to be abusing this and hoarding and speculating. You know, they get the addresses when they need them, and sometimes, even when they need them, they can't afford them. So I support the policy.
Thank you.
Just a question for clarity. So you indicate that utilization is improved because getting these blocks in the hands of network operators, therefore put them to use, and that's an improvement. And I guess I'd have to ask the question, if indeed everyone who makes use of this policy is a network operator, then that would definitely be the case. But it's not clear without any needs basis whatsoever that we know the people who make use of this policy actually have a network at all. And so I hear your point, but it sounds like you're advocating for a policy that says allow transfers to any network operator, not this particular policy.
Allow transfers to anybody who wants to buy the addresses. And in practical terms, it could be a network operator, it could be an end-user organization. In my experience, because I deal with these organizations all the time, I haven't had a single speculator come to me and say, hey, I want to buy some IPs. I think they're going to go through the roof in 10 years. It doesn't happen. I guess to be fair, I had my first speculator today, actually. I got an email from my web form. It was an individual who wanted to invest in an IP address.
I have a few of those, actually.
Yeah, I think he wants to get out of the monthly fees paying Comcast for a static, and you know, he looked at the present value of an IP address and thought that was worthy. But I don't think in general it's a major concern.
Got it. So, very helpful to understand. Thank you.
Is that McTim?
Hi, John. Tim McGinnis here, NABP, but speaking for myself. I guess I said on the mailing list that I could probably go to a /24, but Michael Joseph's words really spoke to me, and I've changed my mind. I'm completely opposed to this policy, as I was previously before I said I would maybe think about a /24. You know, I'm not the sharpest guy in the room, far from it. But for me, it all boils down to, why would you apply for addresses if you didn't need them? And as a former RIR hostmaster myself, I understand that it's really not that difficult to show need. So those are the arguments that really speak to me the most. If you need something, put your hand up for it, and you'll get it, whether it's a transfer or from the free pool. Thank you.
Thank you. What? Well, Heather's in queue too. It's her turn, actually. Okay, Mike, you're it. Mr. Joseph?
All right. Mike Joseph, Google. I just want to respond to a couple of the points that were made. First off, the argument that people are, that my colleague David from Microsoft made, that people are going to buy addresses now, regardless of this policy, and we're simply determining whether who will get updated. You know, that's an argument I hear a lot in terms of eliminating needs basis. And I think the problem with that argument is that, sure, speculators can buy interest in IPs and eventually sell them, and that'll happen. Companies might buy interest in IPs too that they'll eventually transfer, but the key is the eventual transfer part. You see, there's a difference between something that's going to happen because it will comply with policy and somebody buying IPs who will never comply with policy. Companies are not going to buy a /8 if they will never be able to transfer it, if they simply cannot justify it. There's no reason for them to, because the prevailing policy framework won't allow them to take possession of it and use it. Now, people will talk about the shadow market of LOAs and use of address space without being properly titled for that, and that'll happen. And you know what? We have ways as a community we can talk about how we want to tackle that problem, but I don't think the way to tackle that problem is to throw out the policy. But the fact is, people are going to buy addresses who think that they can transfer them. And so what we set here in terms of the transfer bar actually does matter, because it controls what addresses a company will end up being able to take possession of, at least eventually. And that really will be determining overall efficiency. And to the point that was just made about efficiency, after all, isn't it 10% efficiency better than 0? Well, perhaps. But if that was the argument we would make, then we should have given away the free pool a long time ago. Because currently, addresses held in the ARIN free pool have a 0% efficiency. Yet we concluded as a community that we want to strive for a higher efficiency and more fair and equitable distribution of the common resource, the IP address pool of 32 bits, to this community. And so we have an obligation to continuing to drive for efficient utilization of this finite resource. And that means, yes, maybe the person who's only going to use it at 10% doesn't get that block, because the next guy who comes along can use it at 80%. He probably needs it. Thank you.
Allow me to object to the use of throwing out the policy as a statement. I believe the objective here is incremental change.
You have the right to object to any statement I make, of course, but I think many of us in the room view this as throwing out needs basis.
Heather?
I have been waiting patiently. So I have a couple of problems with this. I think that by the way, Heather Schiller, Google Fiber. The problem statement needs work. We need to clearly identify whether we are enacting policy because of staff workload or to make acquisition of addresses easier for customers. It's not at all clear. If it's a staff workload issue, I don't know that changing policy is the best way to handle that. I think that if staff needs additional staff, that's an internal HR issue for ARIN, and they should work through that. The other thing, in terms of getting address space, having moved to the first in, first out policy, at least so transfers aren't affected by first in, first out, but the transfers themselves shouldn't be overall delayed by ARIN staff's review of requests. I think the team review policy on requests for the remainder of the free pool are high because folks are trying to get address space before ARIN runs out. I think that once they get through that period, the amount of time that it takes ARIN to review a request will go down. I think there should be a discussion about the SLA, the expectation of not just staff but in the community of how long it should take ARIN to turn around a request. I think that ARIN staff has been doing a fantastic job. I don't feel that 5 days is unreasonable. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was that so in theory, you're transferring 2 years worth of address space to your organization. So once you go through your initial transfer, in theory, you're not coming back to ARIN for another transfer for 2 years. And I think that in 2 years, their workload will have died down enough that modifying this policy and or eliminating need solely to reduce their workload will no longer be an issue. So I think that taking a longer term view of why you're doing this is worthwhile. And the last thing I want to say is that maybe consider doing something where organizations that have recently made a request have recently been audited by ARIN, kind of a every other time thing where you've recently gone through an audit, ARIN is familiar with what your utilization is, they've gone through everything, and then next time you come back, if it's not more than what you've recently requested, you skip the needs justification, and the time after that you go through an audit again, and that would reduce the overall amount of auditing.
Microphones are closed, Mr. Lee. If it's quick.
Sorry.
He was already there.
Oh, he's already there?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. You seem to have confused some issues here. There's some statements made which are grossly inaccurate, that the only reason somebody buys a block is so that they can transfer it later. That has not proven to be the case. There are examples for those of you that are fearful about what happens to a number of resources when needs assessment are eliminated. I'd refer you to RIPE. If you wanted to get a more long-term historical view of what happens with number resources and their utilization, I'd refer you to APNIC. They went a long time without needs assessment and numbers were allocated. The other thing is there is this misunderstanding about the back pressure of price. Markets behave as markets behave. As supply increases for a given level of demand, prices move accordingly. What is happening today is that transfers are occurring and no one is updating their registry. And that's a bad thing for everybody. So anything you can do to lower the barrier to get your registry accurate is good. It's good for everyone. And to say that you're going to impose a policy constraint or a contract constraint or whatever constraint which provides incentives for your database, your registry database, to become more inaccurate, I would suggest is against your own interests. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank everyone for their input.
Okay, that concludes the discussion of 2014-14. We are going to have a break. You have about 320 seconds, I think. Yep. We're going to give you a 20-minute break. We'll see you back here at 4:45. We'll resume with policy 2014-20, the next policy on the list, at 4:45.